Hello, Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller here, bringing you the best in SF and other stuff as well. Today I want to talk about a subject which is fundamentally important to any proper understanding of the science fiction genre and of fiction, philosophy and reality per se, really, so it's big stuff. This is the first in a series of videos I'm going to be doing about the elements that make up what science fiction is. Now, most people feel they recognize science fiction because of the presence of certain tropes, and that's an easy thing to sort of go with. But if you want to try and define science fiction, which is something we're going to work towards on this channel, it's a lot thornier and more difficult than people think, than just saying science fiction is this, science fiction is that. There's more to it. It's very, very hard to summarize and to bring down to a single sentence, let alone a paragraph. So this is the first of these sort of elements of SF videos that I'm going to do over the next few months, which I hope will get you to look at your reading and to think about it a bit more deeply, and to think about, you know, what makes for satisfying and quality SF, no matter the quality of the writing, because it's a heavily conceptual sort of thing. So today I'm going to talk about something called conceptual breakthrough, which I have mentioned several times in several videos, and it's something that I look for as a marker of high quality SF. Conceptual breakthrough really relies on something called the paradigm. Now, a paradigm is a term which is used in the philosophy of science to indicate a worldview, assumptions we have about the view of the world and how things move forward. Like, for example, you know, back in the days of the Renaissance, when people like Copernicus, Galileo, what have you, came up with the idea that Earth wasn't the centre of the universe, as the church said, you know, and obviously Galileo got into trouble about that, and it could have gone, if he hadn't recanted, it could have gone really, really wrong. So it is fundamental to understanding, not just of science fiction, but of the scientific worldview, our post-Enlightenment world, and where we are in a world of rationality and objectivity, as opposed to magic, non-objectivity, subjectivity, and I believe what I believe even if there's no evidence. So it's going beyond that, because SF is a very important part of the way that Western thinking and objective thinking and rational thinking and the scientific mindset and the advances the science have given us and rationality have given us are come out in the popular vein. You know, it's very, very much a thing. Science fiction is a popular expression of the success in moving the world forward through the Enlightenment philosophies of the West. So it's a really, really fundamentally important thing for our progress in the world, for better health, longer lives, you know, less cruelty, more rights, what have you. So it's a fundamentally important thing. So I'm going to talk about that. So apologies for the digression. The paradigm is something that is an idea that we all embrace. So once upon a time, everybody believed that, you know, the earth was flat, and then people have realized, no, it's not, it's round. And as more and more evidence was discovered, the paradigm expanded and grew out, and, you know, we now have certain beliefs about the world. We have a current paradigm that we all operate within, and we have consensual agreement about it all. Of course, on the edges there are people pushing knowledge forward, there are people arguing for other things. So that's paradigm shift. And of course, any good science fiction novel will begin with a paradigm shift. And to use the classic example, the best examples, it's usually done in the first sentence, and this is a real art and something that few novelists can do. And I think the first sentence of a book is really important. For example, 1984, you get the wonderful line, "It was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Now, there's nothing radical about that, because now we're used to 1300 hours. In 1948-49, when 1984 was written, the idea of having a clock that struck 13 was not something that happened, and it was an idea of embracing a European time thing, an alternate time thing, as opposed to 12 hours and 12 hours on the clock. So that was a paradigm shift. And then Orwell layers other bits of evidence on, other tropes on, to build us into a brand new paradigm, the world of 1984. Another great example is in Christopher Priest's Inverted World, which looks like this. And the opening line after the initial preamble is, "I had reached the age of 650 miles, which is, you know, really sort of opens your head up. And it's that thing about immediately you have a paradigm shift. So that's conceptual breakthrough. And conceptual breakthrough is that point when the paradigm expands either into new knowledge or because knowledge of the world or the world the story setting was incomplete and we learn more, or there's something wrong that we don't know and we discover the right, and so on. So it really is a fundamentally important thing in SF. So I want to talk today about some of my favorite examples of conceptual breakthrough to show you what I mean and how it's used in trying to put together a workable definition of SF and what SF is, what the elements are. Conceptual breakthrough is one of them. So in a really good SF story or novel, you will have a conceptual breakthrough at the beginning, often in the first sentence or paragraph, when the nature of the world as being different from our world is revealed to you through a paradigm shift, through a conceptual breakthrough. In my opinion, the very best SF is marked by a conceptual breakthrough at the very end or near the end of the story, because that opens things up even more, creates what they used to call in the golden age, the sense of wonder. And it really is sort of revelatory, and any SF which doesn't do that isn't good SF. I mean, Philip K. Dick was very much on the record for saying that space adventure fiction wasn't science fiction. Now, to you and me, it obviously was, because it involved the kind of space travel technology that we don't have yet, which itself is a paradigm shift, a conceptual breakthrough. But because it was so well established, he said any story that relied just on that was just an adventure story set in space, wasn't really SF, because it didn't have a conceptual breakthrough. It was all too familiar, so it needed something unfamiliar. Now, Philip K. Dick, of course, grew up reading people like A. Van Vogt, and Van Vogt is sort of central, really, to this. And if you've not read Van Vogt's novel, it's a very short novel, The Weapon Shops of Isha, initially published as The Weapon Shops in a shorter form in Astounding, then you really should. Now, Van Vogt is poorly served by publishers at the moment. There's nothing in print in the UK. There may be print on demand things. I don't think there are. Voyage of the Space Beagle is available in the States. I'm not sure what else is available in the States. But Van Vogt's really fundamentally important. We really do need a good Masterworks edition of Slan and a Masterworks edition at least of The Weapon Shops and Voyage of the Space Beagle. So come on, Golangs, please get it together for us. We'd rely on you for these sort of things. So Van Vogt, to talk about The Weapon Shops, if you haven't read it, it's a really good story. And Vogt was a huge influence on Dick, and he would do these really strange conceptual breakthrough things, and they were really important. And he was sometimes a clunky writer, but he had amazing ideas. And The Weapon Shops, which I somewhere I have a copy of, where is it? Bear with me. Isn't this so unprofessional? It's in here, Golden Age science fiction, and there's a moment towards the end of the full-length version, which is the one not in here, funnily enough, where in the very, very last sentence, one of the characters has undergone this sort of rite of passage, and he's about to discover if he will become one of the future rulers of the Sevagram. And the last word of the book is Sevagram. Now, you are not told what the Sevagram is. It is not even implied what the Sevagram is. It just appears. Now, that word at the very end of that story is conceptual breakthrough, because when people first read, I think it was about 1943, they sort of went, wow, what is this? What does this mean? And it opened up a world of possibilities, a conceptual breakthrough into a new paradigm, to a new way of looking at the world, a new shift. And, you know, that's something we look for in really good SF. It's kind of a punchline, is the simplistic way of putting it. But it's a punchline that involves, you know, looking at the world in a new way, and your thinking just has to change when conceptual breakthrough happens. And you can look at almost any number of events in the real world. You know, I think possibly 9/11 was a conceptual breakthrough moment for many of us, and we realized that, you know, even though the Cold War was over, that there were still dangers, you know, existential dangers in the world. So it's that sort of thing. So this, if you think about history and you think about current affairs, all sorts of things are conceptual breakthrough, and that's why SF is so relevant, because of the importance of paradigm shift through conceptual breakthrough, or the other way around, if you like. So that was fundamental. So Van Vogt really sort of set, you know, the early standard for that, and in that way he massively influenced Philip K. Dick. And I just want to talk about my favorite examples of conceptual breakthrough, particularly in last lines, last words, even last paragraphs in SF, to give you an idea of the sort of things which sort of really, for me, indicate what really great SF is. And I'm going to talk first of all about a book that's very dear to my heart, and it was the first adult novel I read in one sitting. And it was an SF. I'd read kids' books in a single sitting. I'd read adult books in 2 or 3 sittings. It was the first adult novel I read in one sitting, and that's Philip K. Dick's Galactic Pot Healer. Now, I know Moyd over on Media Death Cult is going to do a review of this soon, so I'm not going to do a review. I'm not going to steal his thunder because he's a good lad. But this is the UK first edition of Galactic Pot Healer in Gollop's yellow jacket, and I think it was obviously in the States first. And my first copy is here somewhere. This is my original copy, Pan Lozenge. There we go. And I can remember buying this. I bought it from what is now part of the University of Wales in Treforest, Pontypridd, and that was in 1977, so I was 14. So I wandered onto the campus, and of course I was a young kid, and I was a bit trepidatious. Am I allowed to go onto this polytechnic campus? It was a polytechnic then. The little bookshop, textbooks, and an SF section, and I looked through and I bought this, and I thought, Galactic Pot Healer, what a title. And I discovered Dick sort of a year before that, I think, with Do Androids Dream, and I loved the idea at the time. The cover's so wacky, it's got the Pan Lozenge, and I read the back, and if you've never read this, you should. It's great. As I say, Moyd's going to do a full review, so do watch a review on his channel. But just to say, it's about a unemployed ceramics restorer in the future. In the future, there's a lot of unemployment. You know, if you're a ceramics restorer, you can imagine you're not going to get a lot of action in the future. And he is recruited to go to work at a place called Plowman's Planet, another planet, with a load of other specialists. And they're going to raise a cathedral from the floor of an ocean. How it gets there, you know, who knows. And it's going to be restored. And the people sort of go on a spaceship and they go off to restore it. And they've been recruited by this alien called the Glamour. I won't say any more. It's a great book. It's great fun. It's one of Dick's lighter books. It does have some serious messages in it. It's very funny. And I absolutely love it. It's, you know, it's the sunny side of PKD. And it is one of my favourites. It's in my top 12. Because you know what it's like with PKD. You can't have a top 5. You've got to have 10s because they're so good. So I read that in one sitting. And now I implore you, don't spoil it for yourself. I'm going to tell you why this is important, but at the same time, I'm only going to imply it. What this does in terms of conceptual breakthrough and paradigm shift is that what Dick does very cleverly, or at least he did it to me, he might not to you, he set up my expectations, or he exposed my expectations of what the climax of the story would be. So it was partially from me and partially from him. Now that's art. That's where the two minds that come together and create what Burroughs and Geisen called the third mind. So you've got the mind of the artist and the mind of the audience, and they come together. And you know, and this is why we often respond differently to books, because we have different minds. But it's just part of creating great art, is getting that third mind to sort of happen. And I had certain expectations about what would happen to Joe Bodenland, the sort of Joe Fernwright. Sorry, Joe Bodenland is in Frankenstein Unbound by Brian Aldiss, which is also a Pan Lozenge. And Joe Fernwright, the character in this, you have certain expectations of what will happen to him and what he'll achieve or not, and what will sort of come together. And they are, for me, they were upset and changed in the very last word. So that's a Van Voogdian thing. In the way that Van Voogd used Severgram, and I know I've made that a spoiler, Dick does it with the last word. But I implore you, don't look at the last word and don't read it before you've read the whole book, because you'll ruin it and you'll miss the pleasure. And initially, because I was 14, I wasn't as sophisticated a reader. Initially I thought, oh gosh, you know, and then I realized, you know, that he'd really made me think differently, and it made me think, well, the way I look at the world, I can't make assumptions about it. The whole what is real thing, the ontological questions, which are very big in the work of Dick and other authors I love, like Christopher Priest, J.G. Ballard, came to the fore. And I just realized how wonderfully entertaining it was. So great introduction to Conceptual Breakthrough in the final word of an excellent SF novel, a novel that's fun to read. It's in print. I just love this book. As I say, do watch Moyd's review, because he'll go into a bit more depth about the plot and the characters and what have you. And yeah, just it's fantastic stuff. So that was my sort of number one, really. I'm going to talk you through a few more, and I'm just going to pick them kind of, not kind of randomly, but I'm going to pick them as we go along. I'll try and do a sort of historical thing. And this is the Astounding Analog Reader Book 1 by Aldiss and Harrison. And this is ancient sphere anthology. And of course, Astounding was the magazine which really sort of brought together standards in SF, pulled it out of the pulp era before the golden age, from 25 to sort of 38. And John W. Campbell brought in new editorial standards of literacy, and he looked for sort of certain levels of consistency and innovation and what have you. And that was very important. But before Campbell was editor of Astounding, it was edited for a while by a guy called Harry Bates, who nobody remembers. And Harry Bates is really important because he was the author of a story which was made into one of the most famous and iconic science fiction films, a film you've probably seen half a dozen times. You may have been unlucky enough to see the dreadful remake, but it's The Day the Earth Stood Still. And, you know, I first saw The Day the Earth Stood Still when I was about 8, and I'm sure most of us did as well. And of course, it's iconically important because it introduces the idea of the flying saucer in sort of visual SF and film SF. It's about 1951. And, you know, we'd had about 4 years of saucer sightings then after the famous 47 Kenneth Arnold thing, where the term flying saucer was coined. And, you know, so it's influential. So even if there are no flying saucers, no UFOs, and they were created by SF, they ultimately come from Harry Bates. Now, Harry Bates wrote this story called Farewell to the Master, which was published in Astounding in 1940. So a few years after he stopped being editor. And Harry Bates was quite a guy, and he's quite important. And do look into him. It's very hard to find stuff by him, but Farewell to the Master is the basis of The Day the Earth Stood Still. About 30-40 pages long. It's very good. There are significant differences, especially in the sort of visual sense and the detail of the story, between The Day the Earth Stood Still and Farewell to the Master. So do check out Farewell to the Master. There's probably lots of other anthologies as well. I'm not sure if you can get any Bates collections. I must look into that because I've got one somewhere. Really old one. I can't think what it is. But it's really, really important. Now, and again, there's a punchline. The very, very last sentence or two, particularly the last sentence, which is delivered by one of the key characters. I'm not going to tell you who, it's just a spoiler. You know, it's implied, and it is more or less stated in Day the Earth Stood Still, but it's stated in such a sort of bold and way in a speech that Michael Rennie gives that you don't really take it on board in the same way. And the implication hits you later, if it hits you at all. It really hits you in this because the way Bates has written it. And it's a fantastic story. It's great fun. It's quite sort of pulpy, very golden agey, and it belongs in every good SF collection. So that's another great example, round about the same time as Van Vogt. So Farewell to the Master by Harry Bates. Check it out. Then Heinlein did a good one, a novel which is called Orphans of the Sky. And Orphans of the Sky was published in 2 parts. I think it was in Astounding. One of them was called Universe. I can't think the other part was called, but it was 2 parts, and they were knitted together later as a book. And it's a book about the same size as this book, which I'm going to show you, which is not this. This is not Heinlein. This is Aldous. And it was a Generation Starship story. And I'm sure you probably know what a Generation Starship story is. Generation Starship is where, you know, people are going to go and colonize another planet. It's a great distance off. We haven't got FTL. So people have to go on board. They volunteer to spend their lives on the Starship. They have children there. Their children have children, and so on and so on. And the Generation Starship story first appeared in about 1932. I can't think who did the first one. And, you know, it has been mooted as a serious idea, but do you think anybody would actually do it? I wouldn't, but I'm sure you wouldn't either. But it is a sort of you know, really amazing idea. And of course, in Orphans of the Sky, the characters in it, Joe Jim, the 2-headed mutant, the guy who inspired Zaphod Beeblebrox, I bet you didn't know that either, unless you watch his channel. You know, they sort of live out lives, and they're trying to work out where they are, and they eventually realise they're in a spaceship and what have you. And that comes about halfway through. Now, Aldous, in non-stop here in wonderful pan lozenge again. If you ever find a mint one of these, you know, let me know, because I would talk money with you, because you can't find this mint anywhere. I've never seen a mint one. But this has 2 conceptual breakthrough punchlines, not just one. And I'm not telling you any more than that. So it really is. It really raised the game. It pulled things up. And this is an early Aldous. And I remember reading this the first time thinking, wow, you know, there's the punchline. And then he got me again. It's like doing rounds, you know, with a really great boxer. You go in, you know, and and you admire the footwork and what have you, you know, and you've got your gloves on and stuff, and then, you know, they give you the 1, the 2, and you're down, and you think, oh God, that was painful. But what an experience, you know. It's it's an experience I'd rather not have, but it's akin to that in a sort of literary sense. So great stuff. So Brian really pulled it off in that. It was fantastic, and that was an early one for me as well. This is my 10+1 list really, and in The Man in the High Castle, of course, Dick, you know, did a lot of conceptual breakthrough. And it is in every good SF story, but doing it at the end and really sort of, you know, making you think, wow, what? You know, is really something. And of course, the very last moment of this, when Juliana Frenk meets Hawthorne Absence in The Man in the High Castle, and they talk about what really happened with the war. And he delivers one line, and Juliana walks out the castle, and she's in a realization, and she realizes that, no, I'm not going to spoil it for you, read it yourself. I would be happy, anybody wants to email me and discuss it, because I think a lot of people don't really get that last moment when Juliana realizes what's actually going on. So, and there's different interpretations because there's Taoist ones as well. But yeah, so it's in that as well. So PKD did it a lot, and this is my original Berkeley one. I bought that way back from Forever People in Bristol, which was a great shop. I keep talking about it. So sad, you know, nostalgia, you know, we like nostalgia, but it can be sad as well. Conceptual Breakthrough takes lots of different forms, and a book which did really well back in the early 90s. And this was Conceptual Breakthrough in a really, really new and interesting way, but it could only be done once. And that was China Mountain Zhang by Maureen F. McHugh. And this was a very successful book, and there was a B format edition of this, which I think preceded this one. I may be wrong. And let's have a look. It was published by Tor in 92, and Orbit in 95. And this is a 1999 one, and I got this one because I prefer an A format. It was a B format before that, and they tried to market it like a mainstream novel, which wasn't essentially a bad idea, because what Maureen does in this, and I loved this, it was fantastic. I put it in 100 must-read science fiction novels. She flipped it on its head. We look for conceptual breakthrough in the early part of a science fiction story, and we look for a good punchline at the end where, you know, the conceptual breakthrough goes even further. But what Maureen did in this, she sort of undermined our expectations. First of all, she knows that we're science fiction readers. She knew her readership was science fiction readership. She knew that, you know, we're used to concepts. So this is just about a young American-born Chinese man in the future. And in the future, China is sort of like becomes the dominant power on Earth, rather like America, I guess, is now. And, you know, a lot of people have done that. I mean, this is one of the first ones, and it's really, really good. It's beautifully written. And because he's American-born Chinese, he's inferior to somebody who's Chinese-born Chinese, and that's the sort of way it pans out. And he also happens to be gay, and if you just follow him as he makes his way through society, and he meets different people, and he gradually sort of, you know, goes to university, gets a job, what have you. And it's just about everyday life for this guy in the future, and it's absolutely wonderful. And there's all sorts of great SF stuff, and there's a part when he's living on Mars and he's tutoring people via a video link, rather like Zoom or what have you, which of course we didn't have then. And you sort of, in a way, you wait, because your expectation then is this is going to be a big punch at the end or what have you. And there isn't. But of course, the conceptual breakthrough is that there isn't a conceptual breakthrough, and it's very deliberate, and it's a way of saying, science fiction readers, haha, you know, you think you're going to have this, you think you're going to have that. Let's just talk about the issues facing this character. It's a wonderful character study. Brilliant. Now, of course, somebody like Becky Chambers, who I have reviled shamelessly on this channel, I have to say, apologies if you like her work, and apologies, Becky, it's nothing personal if you ever see this. You know, she just sort of writes about these characters in space, on spaceships, whatever, and it's kind of like soap opera stuff. And this is like soap opera in a way, but this is really elegant. It's a one-off. There's no sequels, none of that nonsense. She does it, she makes a point, she says it, and it said something about conceptual breakthrough, which really, really hadn't been said before in the same way. So it's very, very good. I was very impressed with it, and I loved it. And it's very much, if you've never read science fiction and you want a gentle introduction, give this a go, because this is a nice entry point. It's like a marker between general fiction and genre fiction, so you can go in via that. And if you like SF, even if you like a real serious conceptual breakthrough, give it a read. It's really good. The prose is beautiful, characterization's fantastic, and you really get to root for this character. You really grow to like him, and you want him to succeed against the adversity. And Zhang, he's one of the great characters of modern SF. He really is. So that's Moyne F. McHugh at China Mountain Zhang. Great stuff. It's something that all the good science fiction writers use as a matter of routine if they can, but it's hard to come up with it every time, you know. And one of my favorite examples in a short form is a story by Harlan Ellison from this book, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, which is one of my favorite books of all time. This might be my favorite collection of science fiction short stories. I did a video a while ago about Alfred Bester's The Dark Side of the Earth, which I think is Bester's finest book. 7 immaculate short stories, word perfect. And these are word perfect as well. And like Dark Side of the Earth, this was an early read for me. And this is the Millington UK first edition. And this is just sublime. I'm going to do a video just about this book at one point. And there are later expanded versions. Avoid, try and get this one or the Pan one, because they add stories. And those stories, not that they're bad, but they diminish the impact. Because, you know, I hate it when authors overly revise or revisit or alter the structure of their works, you know, especially when, you know, you've discovered you think they're perfect. And there's some great stories in here, just amazing. And just to stop myself running off at the mouth about this book, there's a story in here called Phoenix. And Phoenix is a fantastic story about a first-person narrative of a very embittered young man who's an explorer, and he's lost his love to somebody with more money. And this chap he's lost his love to hires the narrator to go on this expedition because he's a professional explorer, and he just drips with ire and fire, and it's just wonderfully written and savage, and it's set in a desert. And the last 2 sentences, oh yes, absolutely fantastic stuff. I'm going to say no more, but that's a great example of conceptual breakthrough in the last 2 sentences. So that's Harlan Ellison, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, with particular reference to Phoenix. And Phoenix isn't even the best story in here. And in itself, it's perfect, but there are other even better stories in here, and that's saying something. So yes, I'm very sort of fond of that book, as you can see. So that's a great conceptual breakthrough story. Moving to my left here, you'll see there's a little bit of Christopher Priest here, surprise, surprise. And I think I'm probably going to leave Chris's books till last and pick out a couple of others here, which are also very dear to my heart. And I mentioned recently I did that review video where I reviewed This by Adam Roberts, John Scalzi's Keiju Preservation Society, and I reviewed Elia Whiteley's Skyward Inn, and Emma Newen's Atlas Alone. If you haven't watched that video, do, because it gives you some insights into my feelings about what is good about current SF and what's bad about it. And, you know, there's no Alistair Reynolds, Peter F. Hamilton or Adrian Tchaikovsky in it, you know, and I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. Though I've met them all, they're all nice guys. And I haven't met Adrian actually, and I'm quite fond of Adrian's stuff. I really like Dogs of War, which I have talked about in another video. So, and I think Moyd is going to read that soon. So if you watch Media Death Cult as well, you'll see what he thinks about that. It's a great book. I mentioned this in the part review where I covered the Emma Newman book. And I mentioned that Emma does something which is a bit Deus Ex, and I said that Frederick Pohl did it much better. And if you've got the current Golank's Masterworks edition of this, there's a quotation by J.G. Ballard on the cover, and it just says brilliant. And you know, Ballard didn't go around just saying brilliant about anything. So if he said brilliant about a science fiction novel in the mid-70s, and at that point he was on his Urban trilogy and he was muttering about SF, saying, oh, you know, it's all declining into wish fulfillment fantasies, you know, blah blah blah, you know, don't want to be associated anymore. You know, this really is the thing, and this is the Golank's classic SF B format edition. These were the forerunners of the Masterworks, and I've talked about this before, and it's absolutely beautiful. And there's a marvelous quotation on this, which from the Times. I don't know who wrote it, but it was from the review in the Times. The Times used to review science fiction. Would they do it now? No, of course they wouldn't. Is that a reflection of the quality of the science fiction, or is it a reflection of the Times? I think it's a bit of both, actually. Anyway, the Times said about this book, a soaring monument to mankind's folly, pettiness, and ultimate glory. So that in itself is conceptual breakthrough, you know. mankind's folly, pettiness, and then ultimate glory. Very interesting. It's put the positive and the negative together there, you know, the yin and the yang. So this has wonderful conceptual breakthrough, which comes through in the last sort of chapter or so. And when you realise what's actually been going on, and it's just great. And you know, this is a really important book. I think this prefigures a lot of things that happened in the 80s in cyberpunk and what have you. And if you haven't read it, I mean, I blow very hot and cold about Frederick Pohl. Sometimes I think he did some fantastic work. Other times I think it was less so. But he was very hard working, you know, publisher, editor. He had a huge output. And he did an awful lot for SF, so we mustn't denigrate him. It's just a question of cherry picking his best work. People go on and on and on about Gateway. I find it rather tedious, but that's me. I'm not so much of a space adventure guy. But if you like good space adventure, you'd love Gateway. It's fantastic that way. So it's just not my jam. Anyway, this is really quite something. And one of the great SF novels of the 70s. You know, I put this above, you know, people like, even I love Gregory Benford, for example, but I put this way above. This is really, really gold standard stuff and a fantastic conceptual breakthrough. Read it. So, one more before we move on to The Priester, and that's another book, which I know I probably talked about this as well. It's The Book of Skulls by Robert Silverberg. How I love this book. I love Silverberg. This is one of the big four, as far as I'm concerned. The big four are all currently in Galactic. This, Dying Inside, Downward to the Earth, Time of Changes. Those are the big four. There are other great ones as well. Man in the Maze. You know, there's lots of them. That period between about 66 and 75, and he just didn't put a foot wrong. You know, the guy's an absolute genius, and this is one of them. The Book of Skulls. I love the Book of Skulls because I don't know what it is. All I'm going to say about it is that when you get to the end of this book, you read it. If you read it as a science fiction reader, it's always been packaged and marketed as SF in paperback. The Golank's hardcover was in Golank's Fantasy and Macabre, which was like a little sort of mini sort of subset. Things like Angela Carter's Passion of New Eve was in Golank's Fantasy and Macabre. Grimus by Salman Rushdie was as well, I'm told. And it's really quite something. What I like about this book is I cannot tell whether it is science fiction, fantasy, or just general fiction. I'm not going to tell you why, so you have to read it for yourself. Again, if you read it for yourself and you want to correspond with me about it, I'd be delighted to talk about it. I did write this up in my book 100 Must-Read Books for Men. Silverberg's the only author who got into my 3 must-read books, and I think this is fantastic. There's supposed to be a film being made of it. That's been on the cards for like 2 decades. It hasn't happened. Wonderful road novel, very abrasive, wonderful picture of late 60s, early 70s. Fantastic stuff. I mean, this would make such a great film in the right hands. In the right hands, hopefully. And as I say, the conceptual breakthrough in this is that it leaves you hanging. But it leaves you hanging in a fantastic way. It does resolve, but it doesn't resolve. And that's what's really, really clever about it. The unresolved, resolved ending is one of the hardest things to pull off in fiction. And Silverberg is an absolute master, and he can do it. Interestingly, if you read, I think it's in one of the editions of the SF Encyclopedia, I think it's the current one, it says that Silverberg often does conceptual breakthrough, but he instantly then sort of shows how it's going to be a bad thing for everybody. So is that conservatism? You know, it's quite an interesting point. And that's something I've been thinking about. So when we talk more about Bob, we look at that. But Book of Skulls, great stuff. Finally, onto my favourite living writer per se, and the writer who I think is the finest science fiction writer in the world. I think he's been the finest science fiction writer in the world probably since the 70s. I would argue Ballard. Was Ballard still a science fiction writer in the 70s? Well, yeah, he did things like Hello America. He did a few short stories, but he was doing stuff then. Was it science fiction? Is Crash science fiction? Is High Rise science fiction? I would argue that they changed science fiction, brought it back to melding with the mainstream, which was always a new wave thing, always an English thing, to try and get SF just as part of the corpus of literature, the way it was before the pulp magazines and before the coining of the term science fiction. So I would say if Ballard isn't SF in the 70s, if the Urban trilogy isn't SF, and we can talk about that another time, then Christopher Priest immediately becomes the finest science fiction writer in the world, no question, and because of his facility with conceptual breakthrough. So obviously it's there early in his work with things like Inverted World, So if you haven't read Inverted World, do read Inverted World. And there's a few conceptual breakthroughs in that, and it's great stuff. So it's in Galactic Masterworks. You have no excuse. There's a beautiful New York Review of Books edition available in the USA, so buy that as well. Introduction by John Clute, fantastic stuff. But Chris, for me, was a writer I discovered in the 80s, and his books, I read the early ones and I loved them, and then I read the new books, the 80s books, and there's going to be a video coming up just about his 80s books, and it changed my life completely. And it took my appreciation of conceptual breakthrough, of things like the unreliable narrator, of the beauty of a flat prose style over a verbose one. You know, all those things came into my consciousness in a big way through reading him. And I guess Chris at that point was somebody who was getting more and more critical acclaim. He was making loads of money. And there was a magazine called Granter. There still is a magazine called Granter. And they did an issue called Best of Young British Novelists. The cover looks like this. And if you can get that edition, you know, with that edition of the magazine, it's a magazine, it's in book format, it's sort of a trade paperback. If you can get that one, because that has the original text of what I'm going to talk about. And basically, it was a British Books Marketing Council initiative to sort of bring forward the idea that there was a new generation of British novelists who were all really good, really interesting, did all sorts of different things. And that included people who were already quite established by that time, like Martin Amis and Ian McEwan. Amis's early work, of course, was fantastic, and it's declined by the end of the 80s. McEwan had done some good short stories, but then, you know, gradually went off the boil quite quickly. Also Peter Ackroyd, who's a marvellous novelist and biographer, historian, wonderful, wonderful writer. Julian Barnes, a very sort of mild, sort of satirical writer who I didn't really think very much of. His SF novel, England, England, in which Britain is turned into a theme park, is dreadful. It so lacks subtlety with its sort of obvious targeting. Anyway, I could go on and on. Lots of other writers. Kazuo Shiguru's in there. And it was the people who I was selling a lot of books by early in my career. And it was a very exciting time in British publishing. And I'm going to do a video just about that for fans of general fiction and to get a bigger context at some point. And Chris was one of the writers who was included in that. And he was the only writer who was a science fiction writer in that. And he, in his sort of selection for that, was a short story called The Miraculous Cane. So The Miraculous Cane can now be found in this edition of the Dream Archipelago, which is the current Gollancz edition. It is revised, and to my way of thinking, I don't like the revision. I don't think the revision is as sharp as the original version. So if you can get the version that's in Granter, and I got rid of mine without realising it was revised in this, and so I need to reacquire it. It's fairly common. It was a very sort of popular edition of Granter. And they repeated the exercise, I think, in 93 and 2003, Best of Young British Novelists. They still do it. And what I remember is that everybody who was selected for inclusion, the pieces from their novels, short stories, what have you, became a bestseller, except Chris. And that's because, of course, he was from the world of science fiction, and, you know, and it's what it is. And he was more ambitious than all of them, and in my view, a better writer than all of them as well. So The Miraculous Cane in here, there's a wonderful moment of conceptual breakthrough halfway through, and it's a terrifying story. Absolutely spellbinding. It's really frightening. I guess you could say it's a horror story as well. It is SF, but it works on all sorts of levels because it's the Dream Archipelago. You know, it's flashes of Calvino and Borges, and there's a moment where, again, it's your expectations. It's probably not as shocking and surprising now as it would have been then, for various reasons which I won't go into because there's no spoilers on this part. And what I would say is that you will probably read this and make an assumption, and the way he, well, it's just magnificent. So The Miraculous Cane, one of my favourite short stories. If I could edit a short story collection of SF, this would be one of them. I would love to be able to do that. That's sort of my dream, really, in as much as, you know, actually getting a novel published, having time to write one, finish one and get it published. I'd love to edit an SF anthology. So any publishers out there, you know, you want to give me money, I'll do it. So there you go, the Outlaw Bookseller Anthology, there you go. And yeah, absolutely fantastic. So do watch out for that. But as I say, it was his other 80s work which really put a hook in me, and this book, The Affirmation, which was his new novel at the time that the Best of Young British Novelists anthology from Granter came out, really sort of brought him more forward. This was published by Faber. This was pretty much his last book for Faber, I think. In fact, it must have been the last one for Faber. And they dropped him and they dropped their other SF writers, just the point where he was becoming thing. And then he signed to Cape briefly for his following book. And this is the Arena paperback edition, the UK first paperback of the Affirmation. And the Affirmation is the first full-blown Dream Archipelago novel. There's short stories and novellas before that. Some of them are in An Infinite Summer, like The Negation and The Watched, and there are lots of others, of course, and it's a kind of anti-series, which was what's good about it. And this is absolutely fantastic. And the conceptual, I'm not going to tell you anything about it at all, because I want you to read it. The conceptual breakthrough of this is in the last sentence, I would say in the last word, and you will think, I've thought about this forever, and I will always think about it. And if you read it, you will always think about it. It's a book which will always linger for that reason. And that really is the true art of conceptual breakthrough. And Philip K. Dick does it in Galactic Pot Healer. It's about your expectations. In Priest, it's about the things which cannot be resolved, and the beauty of life in that many things are unresolved, and that's the way they have to be. Sometimes that's the best way. Some things are resolved, some things will never resolve in your life and in our lives. And it's reading Priest brought me to that realization, and it brings you to a sort of new maturity about looking at the world and thinking about the way reality is. And it's, you know, it just sounds melancholic, but it's not. It's this beautiful thing. And the beauty is in the mystery of life. And this is what Priest gets across magnificently in this. It's the mystery that he leaves you with, and that is irresolvable and magnificent. And this is one of my favourite novels. This is in my top 10 favourite novels, I would say. I can't say enough good about this. And then, you know, a few years later, he topped, you know, even that with his finest novel, in my opinion, by a long chalk, and the high watermark of his work. I do generally find the most writers I really like reach their peak in their 40s and produce their best work. They're no longer young, they're not old yet, they still have a sort of protean power, but they've also had time to hone their skill and their craft and their art, and their insights become more profound. And I find that with a lot of my favourite writers. M. John Harrison's another one I think is like that. And this is the Glamour by Christopher Priest. This is the UK first paperback edition. There are 4 different editions of the Glamour. And by edition, I mean edition in terms of contents. I'm using the term correctly. There's lots of different covers and different formats, what have you, but there are 4 different texts. The Jonathan Cape first, he revised the text for this first paperback. He revised it again for the Simon & Schuster one in the 90s. It was revised again for the current Golax ones. I don't like the later revisions as much. The first version is great in Cape. The second edition, or the first revision, as it were, this one in Abacus. It was briefly available in A format, an export edition, which I did have when I got it at the WorldCon. I sold it on years ago. I should have kept it because it was beautiful. Same cover as this. So if you find that in A format, hang on to it. It's the same text, and this is just magnificent. And the Glamour is probably the novel which affected me more than any other, and I think it's the finest modern novel I've ever read. It's absolutely sublime, of any kind. And this is about memory. It's about narrators, and in this, the whole last chapter, which is chapter 10 of the section, and they're marked in Roman numerals, it's marked X. It's the very last letter of the chapter is what really pulls the rug from under your feet and sends you crashing down into a hole which you never get out of, and it's simply fantastic. So I don't really want to say any more, and I can't say any more about it, and it's that the mystery isn't quite as profound in a way as it is in the Affirmation, but the mystery is still there. The enigma is still there. All the questions which Van Vogt and Dick and other people brought into SF about what is reality, what does it mean, the ontological questions, is this real? Am I making it up? Are you making it up? Is an evil demon making it up and sucked me in? You know, all those philosophical questions. In Priest, they are realised, and they are also underlined very subtly as literary devices, and they make you think about literature being a game and how you play that game with the author and you engage with it, and it makes you ask profound questions about yourself. So that's Conceptual Breakthrough, a very important part of SF. The first talk then on the elements of SF, we'll talk about it some more. I've tried to do it off the cuff and make it freewheeling and accessible. Any questions, comments, post them below. Think about it, have a read of those books, and you'll come up with your own examples. There's lots of other examples. I mean, Conceptual Breakthrough is very common in SF, and I do believe that all really great SF novels have it. And I'm not certain that many from the last 20 or 30 years have had it, because it's really hard to come up with new ones. It's a really tough thing. And SF is an evolutionary and revolutionary genre. And what we're seeing in SF in the last 30 odd years is that it's become harder and harder for it to evolve and to spark revolutions and do new things. And that's the same for all the arts. All the arts are suffering from that. We grew up in the age of modernism in the 20th century, when we got used to seeing all sorts of art all the time. The new was always there, and now it's a real crisis. We can't always see the new that we used to, because so much has been done, and that backlog of the arts across the centuries, which was compacted away, which only a few people ever saw, came out in the mass media. We all saw it, and we become addicted to it. There's books about this, Retromania by Simon Reynolds, writings of Mark Fisher. I talk about this in some of my hauntology videos, so do watch those as well. So the arts are in crisis because we've become so used to the new, and we're entering a new phase where we have to accept that craft, is the thing we have to appreciate, but it's not enough for some of us. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. Please subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this. There will be more like this to come, more SF to come, more general fiction. I'm going to start shooting some general fiction stuff soon, because I haven't done it for a while, and I love general fiction as well. And I hope you have a great day. Bye for now. See you soon.